Hello, everyone. My name is Jake Swanson, and today we're going to be talking about George Washington. First, I'm going to be giving a little background about him, and then I'm going to be talking about his leadership styles and how he used those to rise to be known as one of the greatest leaders of all time. Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was the oldest of six children, so he was a natural born leader. Not much is known of his early years. However, it is known that from the years 7 to 15, he was homeschooled on math, science, and literature. However, the most important knowledge he would learn would be learning the skills of growing tobacco, stock raising, and land surveying. Eventually, his father died at the age of 11, and he became the ward of his half brother Lawrence. And Lawrence was a very wealthy person who owned lots of land and was a fine colonial. So George Washington was exposed to a colonial upbringing. In 1748, when he was 16, Washington traveled with a surveying party plotting land in Virginia's Western Territory. And the following year, he was appointed as the official surveyor of Culpeper County. He was busy for 2 years afterwards surveying the land in Culpeper, Frederick, and Augusta counties. And the experience made him resourceful as well as toughened his mind and body, and it also piqued his interest in westward expansion, which became important to him throughout the rest of his career. In 1752, his brother Lawrence dies of tuberculosis, making him the heir of the apparent Washington lands. Lawrence's only child, Sarah, died 2 months later, and Washington became the head of one of Virginia's most prominent estates, Mount Vernon, at the age of 20. Due to his apparent leadership and management of this new land that he has acquired, he is eventually appointed Major of the Virginia Militia. At first, the French and the British were at peace. However, over time, the French began to slowly occupy British territory. However, the details about the borders were a bit sketchy. It was Washington who was sent to first warn the French that they were trespassing into British territory. Washington warned them, to which they shrugged it off, and he fearlessly returned later to seize the territory. They were able to kill the commander as well as 9 others, keeping the rest as prisoners, and the beginning of George Washington, the commander, would begin. Washington later would return and earn the rank of colonel of the British Army for a seat for an expedition on Fort Duquesne. In his first raid, it was unsuccessful, and he left badly wounded. In 1755, he was appointed commander of all troops in Virginia at the young age of 23. It was his responsibility to cover nearly 400 miles of land with just 700 poorly trained soldiers to carry out his tasks. Unfortunately, due to health issues, he was sent home in 1757. In 1758, he decided to retire from the military after a generally frustrating military career at the fault of poor troops and poor support from legislature. His retirement did not last long as he returned to the scene as a politician, being elected to Virginia's House of Burgesses. However, as you will soon learn, this was not an uncommon retirement for him. At first, Washington began on the British side of the war and was skeptical of the colonial uprising. In fact, he was even opposed to the colonial uprising. However, he had also stated that he would support the resistance against the unjust actions of the Crown. This would be seen as he had decided to take action once the Townshend Acts of 1767 were passed. It was at this point he knew that the Crown was committing inhumane acts against the Americans, and he knew he had to step in for equality. It was at this point that he passed an unpopular resolution for Virginia to boycott all British made goods until the acts were lifted. After years of unsuccess, he chairs a meeting calling for a Continental Congress, to which he was elected a delegate. After the Battle of Lexington and Concord, this conflict had become an armed one. During the Second Continental Congress, Washington arrived in a full military outfit, signifying that he was ready to go to war. Because he was fighting for people that were not even his own. Because he was fighting for a cause. because he was fighting for freedom of the people. This conflict becoming a war, Washington was appointed Major General and Commander in Chief of the colonial forces against Britain. This was an honor that he did not ask for, but simply one that people believed he would be the best for due to his prestige, charisma, and experience. However, this was not the perfect fit, as Washington was used to commanding small troops, not large squadrons in the open field of battle. One of his most famous feats in his career was the crossing of the Delaware River. After the British launched an attack and seized New York, Washington ordered his troops to retreat to Pennsylvania. The British general, thinking the war would be on pause for a few months, stored his troops in Trenton and Princeton. Washington then gathered his survivors and led an expedition across the Delaware River in the middle of the freezing night in a tremendous example of bravery. They were largely successful with an attack on Trenton, and a few days later seized Princeton as well in one of the most historic war victories. This was a story of heart and courage that also displayed Washington's great intelligence and war strategy. Britain's main war strategy was to seize the major American cities. Both the British and Americans had suffered victories and losses up to this point. However, when the Americans suffered the loss of Pennsylvania, they were still able to gain support from France. It was at this moment that Washington realized that military victories were just as important as emotional victories. While the British believed taking out American cities would be the key to taking them down, Washington believed this didn't matter as long as people kept hope and he kept the resistance alive. Using this as inspiration, he was able to motivate his troops to win an uphill war in which they were largely outmanned. After the victory of the war, there was lots of fallout. The soldiers were upset that they were done fighting a war that they had not been paid for 5 years and they were still not being paid. Washington stopped a near riot about this by coming to the solution of this issue and adjusting their payments. After this, Washington again retired back to Mount Vernon. Lo and behold, Washington was called back to help the newly formed United States. The United States was struggling under their Articles of Confederation. Washington, however, wanted to keep his hand out of things and focus on maintaining his estate in Mount Vernon. He figured it was a bad idea to intervene on things so soon after their formation. It was not until Shays' Rebellion that Washington decided that he needed to do something. There was then a convention held to amend the Articles of Confederation. Washington was unanimously appointed president. It was then that he, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton came to the conclusion that they needed to come up with an entirely new form of government. It was at this point that they came up with the U.S. Constitution. After creating the U.S. Constitution, Washington believed that he could finally return to Mount Vernon and retire, and so he tried to. However, he was once again called upon to serve his new country as he was unanimously elected to be the first president of the United States, making him the first president in history to be unanimously selected into office by the Electoral College. Washington's role as president was important, as he knew that he would set a precedent for every president after him for the rest of time. Therefore, he put an emphasis on treating others, specifically his subordinates, with respect. He also made a point of emphasis that he did not want to run something similar to a royal court like you would find in Europe, as he felt this bred inequality and tyranny. This is even why he opted to be referred to as Mr. President rather than something like King. He was even humble enough that he declined the salary they offered him to begin with. However, they forced him to take it eventually to avoid the notion that only wealthy men could be president. So now I'm going to be looking at 3 different leadership styles and analyzing how George Washington fit into these different leadership styles and whether they benefited him or not. And the 3 leadership styles we're going to be talking about are the trait approach, skills approach, and the path goal theory. The reason that Washington is considered such a great president as well as all around human is due to his leadership. When analyzing leaders with the trait approach, The common traits of a leader are intelligence, determination, integrity, and physical appearance, and Washington can check almost all of these off. When it comes to intelligence, Washington was very important in this regard. Not only was he homeschooled to learn mathematics, sciences, and literature, but he was able to gain in-field experience with land surveyors and plantation workers. Adding this onto his knowledge of battle makes it very obvious why he was chosen for any of his military positions. Another trait he demonstrated was determination. He did this in an interesting way as he used his actions more than his words to portray his determination. Rather than wait for his yard to be tended to, he would simply jump in and help them to make sure it was done. When the colonials and British began to clash, he showed up ready for war before anyone else, ready to fight for people that were not his, simply because he believed in a cause and wanted to see it through. This same determination can be seen with his military experience as he faced many failures only to come back with many victories. While someone with such wealth and social standing may receive the prejudice of being pompous or selfish, Washington was the complete opposite as he rarely put himself before anyone else. He was known for listening to his peers before making any important decision, and for treating everyone that served under him with just as much respect as anyone else. His honesty and integrity can also be seen when he first becomes president, as we talked about before. He wishes to avoid the royal court that can breed subordination, and that's why he wants to be called Mr. President. As well as this, when he took on the job of president, they offered him a salary which he refused to take. As well as this, George Washington was about 6'2" and 180 pounds. During a time that humans were not generally big, literally giving them someone to look up to. The traits that he was born with, as well as those he learned from being the oldest child and leading commands, made for a perfect combination. These would be the reasons that Washington would be elected to multiple military positions, multiple political positions, and ultimately president, as he had all the qualities you could imagine in a perfect leader. When focusing on the skills approach, it is important to note the specific skills that the leader has developed in order to lead his crowd. These specific skills can be grouped into technical, human, and conceptual skills. When considering someone like George Washington, who was considered top management, it is important that his strengths are in human and conceptual skills, as they are not as commonly in the trenches with their followers. However, Washington was in the trenches when it came to warfare and things of the sort. He displayed tremendous technical skill, for example, when he was the leader for the surveyors of Virginia. He would use his intellect as well as skill with surveying to give people hope in who was leading them. As well as this, Washington displayed great skills in commanding troops as well as with his politics, leading him to be elected for the Constitutional Convention as well as for presidency. When it came to human skills, Washington was just as adept. As mentioned multiple times before, he would often fight in the front lines of his troops. As well as this, he was known for bestowing trust and respect in every person that reported to him and those that worked in his cabinet. He was known for treating others like equals as well as being an extroverted person. People felt comfortable coming to him and he felt asking others for help. This allowed for a fluid relationship between himself and his followers and allowed Washington to put himself in his followers' shoes. Lastly, his conceptual skill. This was Washington's main strength. When elected as president, as well as to lead the Constitutional Congress, he did not really want to. It's almost as if he had no choice, as his followers saw that he was the perfect option for their new leader. This was due to all the skills and experience that he possessed. He had military experience and he had political experience. He knew how to institute political policy, he knew how to command troops, and he was able to adapt his small troop style to large troops. He knew how to organize and command his troops to complement the other leadership skills that he possessed. When it came to these three general skills, Washington exhibited them all with the strength in the more important ones, making him the ultimate skills approach leader. The path goal theory essentially focuses on how the leader motivates the follower to do their job by highlighting the rewards and incentives for them. I believe this is one of Washington's strengths, as he was fighting an uphill battle oftentimes. This is especially apparent when it comes time for George Washington to lead his troops in the American Revolution. The colonials were outnumbered vastly by the British and did not have near the same land or supplies that they had. The British were actually capturing a lot of the major cities, and everything seemed to be going against the colonials. The one thing that seemed to keep them in there was George Washington. George Washington's greatest strength in this war was keeping the hopes of the people alive. Washington had soldiers fighting a losing battle after not being paid for the last 5 years. Washington was able to rally his troops and do this by highlighting to them what was at stake. When analyzing path goal theory, it is important to note how the leader incentivizes the followers. Washington did this by telling them what he believed. He believed they were fighting for their freedom, their livelihood, and their families. At this point, all that the followers really yearned for is participative leadership, which was one of Washington's strengths. As mentioned, with him helping his workers do their jobs as well as crossing the Delaware, Washington was always there for his people. Despite being a high ranking official, he was always on the front lines helping out those who were helping him. Whether it be for chores or going into battle, he never put himself above others and made sure to let them know that they were not alone. He made them believe that if they were fighting for someone who would do the same, that they would all achieve their common goal. While there were many different styles of leadership that George Washington exhibited, I believe that these were the three most important and that allowed him to be one of the greatest leaders in America's history. That's all I have for you. Thank you for listening.